I woke up today with an unfamiliar tightness in my chest, the kind that nags at you before you can even put a name to it. Maybe it was the light slanting differently through the curtains, or maybe it was the phone call. A woman, voice trembling, asked if I could help her find out whether her husband was cheating. But it wasn't just the affair that had her shaken. She spoke of strange shifts in his routine, small, almost imperceptible changes that unsettled her deeply. I agreed to take the case, even though I knew what it could lead to. As a former cop turned private investigator, I'd seen my fair share of things that should have been left alone. But curiosity is a powerful thing. And maybe this time, it wouldn't be as dark as I feared. I set up my surveillance gear, piecing together what little I could from her sparse details. His movements were ordinary at first, predictable. He came home late, left early, kept to himself. But over the course of a few weeks, I started to notice small deviations, things that didn't fit. Then one day, he left work earlier than usual. Something about it felt wrong, like a door creaking open that shouldn't have been. I followed him, keeping a safe distance as he made his way to an isolated part of town. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across a field of dry grass. He stopped at the edge of a desolate street, and I stayed hidden, heart pounding in my chest. There was something about the way he moved, the air of hurry around him that raised every red flag I had. It wasn't just an affair. Not anymore. He met a woman there, a stranger, though I thought I recognized her from somewhere. But there was no warmth between them, no fondness. He couldn't even meet her eyes. His hands fidgeted, as if they had a mind of their own, and every few seconds he'd glance over his shoulder, as though afraid someone was watching. My stomach tightened. The unease in the air thickened like fog, pressing against my ribs. This wasn't what I expected. They exchanged something then, small, wrapped items. There was no mistaking it. This wasn't a simple affair. The way they moved, the deliberate secrecy of their gestures, it felt wrong in a way that made my skin crawl. The woman said something about the transfer being ready, and his response was a jerky nod, too eager, too anxious. My hands were shaking as I watched through the lens of my camera. It wasn't just infidelity anymore. This was something else, something darker. I waited longer, the minutes stretching. My mind spun with possibilities. I had to know what they were doing, where they were going. So I followed them, keeping a careful distance, slipping between shadows as they made their way down unfamiliar roads. The night swallowed everything around us. Over the next few days, he returned to that same spot, the woman always there with him. It became routine, exchanging packages, never a word spoken between them, just brief nods and tight smiles that didn't reach their eyes. The air around them pulsed with something I couldn't name. Fear, paranoia, guilt. One night, I got a clear shot of the package they passed between them. It wasn't drugs, wasn't any illicit contraband I could recognize. It was cash, thick stacks of it. I felt a cold jolt run through me. Money laundering, maybe? Or something worse? Whatever it was, I was no longer dealing with a simple cheating husband. Something much larger was unfolding here, and with each passing night, I was falling deeper into something I wasn't sure I could escape from. I should have walked away, but I didn't. I couldn't. I knew it was time to dive deeper, to peel back the layers of this mess and face whatever lay beneath. My tools were more advanced now, tracking financial records, tracing shell companies, analyzing patterns. And what I found made the pit of my stomach twist with unease. This wasn't just infidelity. No, this was something much worse. Transactions between anonymous accounts, money flowing through shadowy channels, and suspicious ties to local drug distribution networks. A quiet, insidious web stretching out in every direction. The deeper I went, the more suffocating the weight of it all became. Every new piece of evidence felt like an anchor, pulling me further into a storm I couldn't escape. This wasn't just a man cheating on his wife. This was a criminal underworld that threatened to destroy everything in its path. And here I was, holding the keys to it all. By nightfall, the urgency of it settled in my bones like ice. I had to act. I had to confront her, to tell her everything. She deserved the truth, even if it shattered her life. The consequences, though, they could be devastating. For her, for him, for everyone. I grabbed my car keys, my hands trembling, and drove through the dark streets, the weight of the evidence pressing down on me with each passing second. When I pulled up to her house, my pulse hammered in my ears. I didn't know if it was fear, guilt, or something darker, but my hands were slick with sweat. The front porch light flickered, casting strange shadows across the lawn. I rang the doorbell, and she answered quickly, her face tired, but trying to mask it. That was when I saw it. She already knew something was wrong. There was no warmth in her eyes, just a flicker of dread, like she could sense the weight of the storm coming. I stepped inside, the air thick with an unsettling silence. She motioned for me to sit. Her living room, normally a sanctuary, felt like a prison now. I didn't waste time. I laid everything out. Photos of the meetings, financial statements, evidence of the drugs. Her hands shook as she flipped through it, her face flickering between confusion, disbelief, and finally, despair. I saw her face collapse, crumple under the weight of the truth. Tears welled in her eyes, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She looked like someone who'd just discovered the ground beneath them had opened up into nothing. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't just about betrayal. This wasn't a secret marriage. This was something far more dangerous. And I had just handed it to her, all at once. I wanted to say something, to offer comfort, but the words felt hollow, useless. So I stayed silent, watching as she collapsed into herself, her body shaking with quiet sobs. She could hardly breathe, as if the air itself had turned thick and suffocating. I don't know what to do now, she whispered, her voice cracking. Her tears reflected the hopelessness she must have felt. I need time. For me. For the kids. I need to figure out what's next. I couldn't do anything but nod. The truth had ripped her world apart, and as I sat there in that frozen silence, I felt the weight of it too. Because in the end, it wasn't just her life I had ruined. It was everyone's. And I had no idea how any of us would put it back together. In the days that followed, I watched her transform, piece by piece. She made the difficult choice to leave him. Her mind set on protecting the children, on rebuilding their lives away from the lies and the chaos. I did what I could to help, pushing her toward therapy, helping her understand the depth of the danger that still lingered. But there was only so much I could do. In the end, she had to make the hard choices. I handed all the evidence over to the police, hoping that justice would somehow find a way to untangle the mess. But the wheels of bureaucracy turned slowly, and in the end, it all felt like it had been for nothing. He slipped through the cracks, his life seemingly untouched by the revelations, as if nothing had ever happened. I don't know what became of him, or if the evidence I collected even made a difference. All I know is that I'll never forget that look on her face, the way she crumbled under the weight of the truth. That's the thing about investigations like this. Sometimes it's not about uncovering the truth at all. It's about discovering that the truth is something no one should have to bear. To this day, that case hangs over me. There are still pieces missing, still questions unanswered. And every time I close my eyes, I wonder if there's something even darker lurking behind what I found. It all started on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, a day that felt heavier than most. I received the call, a desperate, almost broken voice on the other end. It was Emily's family. Their daughter had disappeared after a violent argument with her boyfriend, Jason. The police had already investigated, but their efforts had amounted to little. They were losing hope. They didn't know where to turn next. And that's where I came in. As a private investigator with over a decade of experience in tangled dark cases, I felt I could help. I started with Jason. He was acting off. He kept to the edges of things, like he didn't want to be seen, didn't want anyone to get too close. The first few days were quiet, but every move he made sent a ripple of discomfort through me. I followed him, noted his habits, his strange detachment. That's when I discovered his history. Violent outbursts, threats, a trail of anger that had always seemed to slip through the cracks of the law. Never arrested, never held accountable. Just a pattern of rage that no one could ever pin down. The more I learned about him, the more I felt like I was peeling back layers of something far darker. I knew Emily wasn't just missing. I knew it now. She was in danger. By Wednesday, my gut was telling me to dig deeper. I spent hours poring over Jason's history, old acquaintances, neglected records, even talking to people the police had never bothered to reach out to. And the more I found, the more disturbed I became. The man was a powder keg, always teetering on the edge of violence. And now Emily was gone. My stomach churned with the weight of it. I kept my surveillance on him, following him from morning until night, trying to catch any slip, any sign. And then I saw it, the abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. Jason passed it often, always slowing down, as if something inside was calling to him. It was a place forgotten by time, with broken windows and walls covered in layers of graffiti. A place that whispered secrets into the wind. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up every time I saw it. It felt wrong, like a trap. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was where everything was leading. So I decided to act. I waited until nightfall, my pulse already thumping in my ears. Jason left his apartment as usual, and I followed. It was the same as always. He drove straight to the warehouse. I parked a safe distance away, heart pounding in my chest. The night air was thick, heavy with the scent of rain and rust. I tried to steady my breath as I moved quietly through the streets, slipping like a shadow behind him. The warehouse loomed ahead, even more sinister up close. The door was slightly ajar, as if someone was expecting me. My hands trembled as I approached. the faintest creak of my footsteps ringing out in the stillness. Inside, the air was stale, tinged with the smell of mold and decay. My flashlight flickered as I scanned the room, and then I saw it. Dark, sticky stains on the floor. Blood. My stomach twisted, but I forced myself to follow the trail. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the ground itself was pulling me towards something I wasn't ready for. The trail led me to the back, to a room hidden in the shadows. There, in the dim light, was Emily. Her body lay unnaturally still, her once vibrant face frozen in a silent scream that would never reach anyone's ears. My knees almost buckled beneath me. I tried to steady myself, but the weight of what I was seeing pressed down hard on my chest. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. My heart felt like it was going to beat right out of my chest. I should have stepped back. I should have left, but I didn't. I knelt beside her, my hands shaking as I began to document the scene, snapping photos with a mechanical precision that felt detached, like I wasn't even there. Her skin was pale, almost translucent in the low light, and her eyes, God, her eyes, stared up at the ceiling, hollow and empty. I felt like I was suffocating in that moment, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I wanted to scream, to run, but I stayed. I had to. I owed it to her family, to bring the truth to light. Every detail seemed darker than the last. The cold, sterile air, the thick, acrid scent of blood still lingering in the room. I took photo after photo, documenting every corner of the space, but it didn't matter. No image could capture the horror of it, the finality of what had happened to her. I wasn't just uncovering the truth. I was witnessing the end of a life and the beginning of a nightmare. As I stood there, documenting every detail, my eyes caught small things, things that might have been overlooked in the rush of the investigation. A lone glove, discarded carelessly near Emily's body. The marks on the floor, jagged and desperate, telling a story of struggle. The pungent metallic scent of blood still hanging thick in the air. My instincts screamed that there was more here than just a murder, more than Jason's guilt. Perhaps the police had missed something. Perhaps there were pieces of a puzzle they hadn't even considered. I mentally retraced every step that had brought me to this warehouse, and the weight of the realization hit me like a blow to the chest. I was closer to the truth than I had ever been. With my heart still pounding, I forced myself to leave the scene. The moment was overwhelming, like stepping out of a nightmare and into the harsh light of reality. But I had no time to waste. Every minute was crucial if I was going to make sure Jason was found and held accountable for what he had done. As I drove away from the warehouse, the adrenaline of discovery still surged in my veins, but the brutal weight of what I had uncovered left me feeling hollow, exhausted. Still, I couldn't stop. I had to finish what I had started. My phone buzzed, jarring me out of my thoughts. It was time to act. I called the police, my voice shaky as I rattled off the details. Everything I'd found. The bloodstains, Emily's lifeless body, the glove, the marks on the floor. I described the warehouse, how Jason had frequented it. I could hear the urgency in my own voice, as if I could somehow push them into faster action, make them understand the gravity of the situation. As I hung up, the sense of urgency didn't fade. It only deepened, gnawing at me. It wasn't long before the wail of sirens split the night. The police arrived, ready, equipped, and swift. They moved into the warehouse with the precision of people who knew they were walking into something dangerous. They followed my instructions carefully, stepping through the door with the kind of caution I hadn't been able to afford. Moments later, the confirmation came. Jason had been found. He was being arrested. The tension in the air finally began to dissipate, but it wasn't relief that I felt. It was a strange mixture of exhaustion and something else, something deeper. Watching the officers lead Jason away, I saw it in Emily's family's eyes. A glimmer of hope, yes, but it was fleeting. Their faces were still twisted in sorrow, their grief too raw to be washed away by mere justice. The sense of finality seemed so far away. Nothing could bring Emily back. I spent most of the following day with her family. They were still in shock, reeling from the brutality of it all. Emily's mother, red-eyed and trembling, thanked me over and over again, but her words felt hollow. I could hear the desperation in them, the desperation of someone trying to find meaning in the face of irreversible loss. No matter how many times she said it, no words would undo what had been done. Every glance they exchanged, those moments of silence, spoke volumes. They were left with only the fragments of the life they had shared with Emily. As I left their home that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had done more than just solve a case. I had waded into a family's rawest pain, and no matter how much I tried to distance myself from it, it clung to me like a second skin. The image of Emily, lying there so lifeless, remained burned into my mind. The sharpness of the bloodstains, the coldness of her empty gaze. I thought I could handle it. I thought I could compartmentalize the horror. But the truth was, I wasn't sure I could ever escape it. That night, I returned to my office, the stillness of the room pressing in on me. The hum of the fluorescent lights seemed too loud in the quiet. I tried to focus, but my thoughts kept circling back to that dark warehouse. The feeling of Emily's life slipping away in that cold, forsaken place. I couldn't get rid of the images. They gnawed at me, kept me awake. The nightmares started soon after. Fractured flashes of Emily's face, the cold, lifeless body, Jason's smugness as he was arrested. I couldn't shake them. It wasn't just the case that haunted me. It was the brutality of it all. The unrelenting truth that sometimes there's no neat ending. Even with Jason behind bars, I felt a cold, unsettling presence in my office, an emptiness that no amount of justice could fill. I couldn't stop replaying every detail, wondering if I'd missed something. A feeling deep in my gut told me there was more. More to the story, more to the crime. My mind wouldn't quiet. The case had been solved, but the horror of what I had seen never truly left me. It never would. Today, I still carry the weight of that day. Emily's face, her lifeless stare, follows me in my quiet moments, when the world is still. And my thoughts are all I have to keep me company. Sometimes, it feels like I'm being watched. Sometimes, I wonder if I'll ever be able to leave this case behind, or if it will always be an indelible part of my story, haunting me, lingering in the shadows of my mind. My name is Alain, and before all of this, I was a police inspector in Paris. Years spent with my hands stained by the bureaucracy and exhaustion of the system. I left it behind in 2017, seeking a quieter life as a private investigator. I thought I'd be done with the kinds of cases that kept me awake at night. Small affairs, petty corporate thefts, the usual. But then, one rainy afternoon, I got an urgent call that would change everything. A man named Jean-Luc, a well-known businessman from the Loire Valley, a man who'd built his empire with the same careful precision he put into his wines, was trembling on the other end of the line. Jean-Luc sounded nothing like the refined, controlled figure I had heard of. His voice was sharp, rattled, desperate. "I'm afraid for my family, Alain," he said, almost gasping for breath. "Philippe, he's threatening me." Philippe was a man from Jean-Luc's past, an old friend from their university days. Once, they'd shared everything, but now, it seemed, Philippe was driven by something darker. "He knows where my children go to school, Alain," Jean-Luc choked, his words barely audible. "He said he's going to destroy me. At first, I thought it was just another bruised ego, a minor dispute between old friends. But when I met Jean-Luc at a café in the Quartier Latin, I could see the fear in his eyes. He looked drained, like a man who had seen his world start to crumble and had no way of stopping it. His graying hair was combed meticulously, his suit bespoke and sharp. But his face, those eyes, told another story. Philippe wasn't just angry. He was dangerous. He had fallen into financial ruin, and now he was willing to do anything to drag Jean-Luc down with him. The threat wasn't just a business deal gone wrong. It was something far more sinister, something personal. My job seemed simple enough. Follow Philippe. Find out what he was up to. I started with his apartment in Le Marais, a place that spoke of failure more than success. The apartment, small and run down, didn't reflect the kind of life a man like Philippe should have had. Yet there he was, lingering at the edge of society, in desperate attempts to maintain the tough exterior of a man who had once had it all. I began following him, taking note of every detail. But it didn't take long before I realized things were far worse than I'd imagined. Philippe had become reckless. He started selling off valuable items, things that any man in his position should never part with: watches, old art, antiques. I saw him enter a small cafe on Rue de Rivoli one afternoon, flanked by two men whose tattoos made it clear they weren't the type you met for a friendly drink. Their eyes locked with Philippe's in a way that made my stomach twist. These weren't friends, not even business partners. They were bad news, and Philippe was drowning in a sea of debts that ran far deeper than just money. The more I followed, the more it became clear. Philippe was tangled in something far darker. He was in debt to loan sharks, blackmailed by criminals who had no intention of letting him off the hook. They were using him, manipulating him, and now they wanted something from Jean-Luc, his vineyards. They planned to force Jean-Luc to sell at a price that would ruin him. And if Philippe couldn't get what he wanted through threats, the violence would be the next step. I wasn't just chasing down an angry man. I was chasing a desperate, broken person, caught in a web of crime he could no longer control. Then one night, I followed Philippe to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Paris. The building was a decaying relic, neglected by time, just like Philippe himself. I stayed hidden behind a rusted wall as I overheard snippets of a conversation that made my blood run cold. "We'll make him feel it," one of Philippe's associates said, his voice dripping with venom. "We'll make Jean-Luc lose everything." I knew then that things were spiraling out of control, that Philippe was no longer just a man with a grudge. He was preparing for something far more catastrophic. Philippe knew he was being followed. He was erratic, paranoid, and yet there was a strange indifference in his behavior. Perhaps it was because he believed there was no going back. He didn't care that I was tailing him, because in his mind, the endgame was already set. Every time I saw him leave one of his secret meetings, there was an icy coldness to him, a finality. It was clear he was planning something violent, something that could break Jean-Luc's life forever. By the end of the week, I intercepted a chilling conversation between Philippe and one of his criminal associates. "We'll infiltrate his house," Philippe said, his voice low and controlled. "It'll be more than just threats. This time, we make it real." I felt my heart drop into my stomach. This wasn't just a business dispute anymore. This was something far more dangerous. And Jean-Luc had no idea just how close he was to losing everything. I went straight to Jean-Luc's office in downtown Paris, where he had isolated himself after receiving some of the more severe threats. The tension was palpable the moment I stepped inside. Jean-Luc looked a far cry from the polished businessman I had first met. His suit was perfectly tailored, but his eyes, those tired, hollow eyes, told a different story. He was running on fumes, no longer the man in control. I explained the situation quickly, the gravity of the situation sinking in as I spoke. I suggested he hire private security immediately. His face tightened as the words hit him. "I knew it had come to this," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "But to what end?" After a long discussion, he finally agreed. We arranged a meeting with a security company, and within hours, we had a plan in motion. I hoped the added protection would give him peace of mind, but something about the situation made me uneasy. Jean-Luc's calm on the outside seemed almost too controlled. That night, as I was leaving the office, my phone buzzed with an urgent message. Philippe had disappeared. He had been spotted at a train station on the outskirts of Paris, apparently trying to flee the city. But his escape had failed. His frantic attempt to vanish had turned into a dead end, and the authorities were closing in on him. The next day, I joined the police and Jean-Luc's security team at the train station to investigate. It wasn't long before we found him. Philippe was intercepted trying to hide in a freight car, a fugitive with nowhere to run. As he was cuffed and led away, something I didn't expect came to light. In his possession, we found a list. Names, dates, and details of the entire extortion scheme, his network of criminals, the threats against Jean-Luc's family, the planned escalation of violence. Philippe had underestimated just how much trouble he'd gotten himself into. As he was taken away in silence, his expression was unreadable, but there was an unmistakable look in his eyes. He knew his game was up. He was no longer just a desperate man. He was broken, completely crushed by the weight of his own choices. Jean-Luc's relief was immediate, but it didn't last long. He called me later that day, thanking me with a voice that was both grateful and somehow distant. There was something in his tone, a trembling edge I hadn't heard before. "It's over, Alain," he said, but I could tell that, for him, it wasn't. When we met later, Jean-Luc was quieter than usual. His words seemed weighed down by something far heavier than the stress of the situation. "I never imagined it would end like this," he said softly, almost as if speaking to himself. "Philippe, my friend, became a monster. But who are we, really? What's the line between friendship and betrayal?" I didn't know how to respond. His voice, thick with emotion, lingered in the room, his vulnerability raw. It wasn't just Philippe he was questioning anymore. It was himself. The betrayal had shattered something in him. He didn't just lose a friend. He lost a part of himself. When I left that meeting, I couldn't shake the feeling that the job was done, but something had shifted inside Jean-Luc. His relief, however genuine, had already begun to sour into something else. Mistrust, regret, maybe even fear. The kind of fear you can't see coming. The kind that settles in your gut long after the danger has passed. Back in my office, I found the silence almost suffocating. I replayed the entire case in my head, from Jean-Luc's desperate phone call to Philippe's downward spiral. How had Philippe gotten so lost? What had turned that man, a once proud figure, into something so unrecognizable? I never had the answer. All I knew was that sometimes the most terrifying thing isn't the enemy we see coming. It's the person we think we know best, the one who has the power to destroy us from the inside out. As I closed my office door behind me, the weight of the case settled in. Philippe might be behind bars, but the damage was done. Jean-Luc's trust had been broken beyond repair, and the question that lingered in the air would never fully be answered. What is the true cost of betrayal? I never expected an investigation that started as mundane as a supermarket theft to lead me down a rabbit hole so twisted, so unsettling. The case was meant to be a simple one. My name is Saoirse, and I'm a private investigator, still building my reputation, taking on the smaller cases to get my foot in the door. About 6 months ago, the owner of a local supermarket reached out. There had been a string of thefts. Small things at first, easy to ignore. But they weren't going away. Staff members were being accused, but no one would admit to anything, and the evidence didn't lead anywhere. The whole place was on edge, and the owner was desperate. He needed answers, and that's where I came in. It was supposed to be a straightforward job. Interview the staff, check the security footage, maybe look for any weak links. But when I walked through those sliding glass doors for the first time, something felt off. It was subtle, like the low hum of a broken light fixture or the faintest scrape of a chair leg against the floor. The place was typical. Shelves stacked with boxes, the scent of stale coffee in the air, the dull murmur of shopping carts rolling over tile. But there was an undercurrent. The tension was thick, almost palpable, like everyone in the store was holding their breath. Cian, the manager, met me by the produce aisle. I could tell from the way he avoided my eyes that something wasn't right. He was nervous, sure, but it wasn't just that. He was too nervous. The way his gaze kept darting to the security cameras, as though he was expecting someone, or something, to be watching him at any moment, made me uneasy. He told me about the thefts in a voice that cracked under pressure, but the details didn't add up. Something in the way he spoke, the way his hands trembled, made it clear that he wasn't just concerned. He was hiding something. The employees were no better. Most of them gave the impression of someone caught in the act, but none of them could be pinned down. Their discomfort hung in the air like a cloud. Jennifer, a young cashier with too many freckles and tired eyes, stood out. She was the most visibly shaken. Her hands shook when she reached for the register, and her voice trembled when she spoke. But it was one offhand comment she made that I couldn't shake. "I know they're watching me," she said. her eyes darting toward the back room. I know someone's keeping an eye on me. It didn't seem like a nervous joke. It felt like a warning. When I asked her what she meant, she clammed up, her gaze turning cold, the kind of look someone gives when they're afraid of saying too much. She walked away without another word, but I could feel the weight of her silence. Days turned into weeks, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something. The thefts had started to take on a strange rhythm, a disturbing lack of logic. A pack of diapers would vanish, but the rest of the personal hygiene aisle would remain untouched. In the canned goods section, a can of beans would disappear, yet the rest of the stock seemed untouched. The pattern didn't make sense. It felt less like someone was stealing on impulse, and more like someone was carefully curating the losses. I focused on the shifts, and it didn't take long for the truth to start bubbling up, sour and unsettling. Cian was always there, lurking in the background during the thefts. He wasn't directly involved. He was too clever for that. But I'd catch him lingering in corners, watching the others with an odd intensity, as if he were waiting for something, watching for something. I started to see him for what he was, a puppeteer pulling invisible strings. Then came that afternoon, when Jennifer, eyes wide, frantic, like she couldn't hold it in anymore, whispered, "They're all involved, Saoirse. It's not just us. It's Cian. He's orchestrating everything." The words hit me like a slap. Before I could ask her to explain, she vanished into the back room. The look in her eyes, desperation, fear, told me I'd just scratched the surface of something dark. I couldn't leave it at that. I spent hours combing through security footage. I knew something wasn't adding up. And then I saw it, a grainy video of an employee swiping a pack of meat. But there, just behind her, was Cian. He wasn't just passing by. He gave her a quick nod, almost imperceptible, a confirmation that made my blood run cold. It was as if he was supervising, not simply overseeing. He wasn't just a part of it. He was the one pulling the strings. The thefts weren't random, not at all. They were calculated, planned, and now I had to figure out exactly what he was hiding. This wasn't just petty theft. No, this was something much bigger, something far darker. The decision to step into Cian's office that night wasn't one I made lightly. I had a gut feeling, an instinct that whispered to me that something was hidden in that room. I knew the thefts were just the surface of something deeper, something darker. But what? I couldn't say. I didn't even know exactly what I was looking for as I rifled through his desk, feeling like a trespasser in a game I wasn't sure I understood. But my hand shook as I tore through the papers, as if I had already crossed a line I couldn't uncross. And then I found it. A list of numbers, meticulously written, each item marked with a value that seemed far too low. A pack of meat worth $10 recorded as $2. A box of cereal listed for $1 when it should have been $3. And then the signature. Cian's signature. A sickening realization hit me, cold and sharp. The thefts weren't the crime. The thefts were a front. He wasn't just stealing inventory. He was fabricating losses to cover up something much, much worse. He had been manipulating the inventory system, using the thefts as a smokescreen for embezzlement. This wasn't just a man swiping a few items off a shelf. This was a calculated, premeditated fraud. A complex web spun with precision and I was standing right in the middle of it, piecing it all together. But as the pieces clicked into place, a deep, uneasy feeling crept over me. I knew I had to act fast. The walls were closing in. I could feel the tension, the weight of Chian's suspicion pressing down on me. I had become a player in his game, whether I liked it or not. The air seemed thicker with every passing moment, suffocating. If he discovered what I knew, I didn't even want to think about it. I bolted to the company's financial system. My fingers moved with purpose, but the unease only grew as I dug deeper. Sales reports, invoices, everything was rigged. Items listed at inflated prices, inflated quantities. I wasn't just looking at theft now. I was staring at a carefully constructed empire of lies. It wasn't just money being stolen. It was trust. It was people, manipulated into compliance, their guilt twisted until they believed they were the ones responsible. And Cian, he was at the center of it all, pulling the strings, directing the play, while everyone else just played along. Once I had everything, I contacted the police. The arrest was swift. Cian didn't stand a chance, but as the officers led him out in handcuffs, I felt no relief, no sense of victory, only the sting of disillusionment. The employees were cleared of the accusations, but when I saw their faces, relieved, yes, but also haunted, I couldn't shake the question that gnawed at me. Did they really know nothing? Some of them, in passing conversations, told me how Cian had controlled them, how he'd made them feel like puppets, like nothing more than players in a game they couldn't comprehend. And Jennifer's words, "I know they're watching me," they made perfect sense now. Cian had manipulated everyone, and even when they weren't aware of it, they were complicit. He played on their fears, their insecurities, until they'd lost all sense of what was real. They had become his unwitting accomplices. But the worst part wasn't the fraud. It wasn't even the arrest. Number. The worst part was what came after. I remember standing in front of the mirror that night, staring at myself. I'd solved the case. I'd exposed the fraud. But as I looked at my reflection, all I could think was, what else are people hiding? How much of the world is built on lies? Small ones, big ones, and how many of us are too blind to see them. I had learned the hardest lesson of all. Trust is fragile, and once it's broken, it's almost impossible to put back together. The trust I'd placed in people, in myself, had shattered. Investigative work, it's a dangerous thing. The deeper you go, the more you realize that truth and lies aren't always as clear-cut as you want them to be. Sometimes, the truth is more dangerous than the lie. Cian had been a monster, sure, but the real horror was the people, the ones who knew, or thought they knew, and yet still played their parts. I still think about that place, the supermarket, the employees, the eerie way the air felt thick with suspicion, with secrets. And sometimes, when I'm walking through the city, or when I catch someone's eye across the room, I wonder, what are they really thinking? What are they hiding? It's a thought that haunts me, even now. The case was solved. Cian was behind bars. The theft stopped. But something inside me broke that day, and I don't think I'll ever be the same. I don't think I can be. The supermarket moved on. The new management was careful, too careful. But for me, that place will never be the same. It's a graveyard of lies, and I'm left standing in the ruins, wondering just how deep the lie really goes. I'd always imagined that retirement would bring peace, a quiet life after decades of service with the LAPD. At over 60, I'd closed that chapter, trading in the adrenaline of investigations for the calm rhythm of running a small private investigation office downtown. My office was modest, just a cramped room in a weathered building, the kind of place where the city's pulse was faint, muted by the dull hum of old fans and traffic far below. My clients were mainly businesses with petty problems, missing person cases, and the occasional cheating spouse. Nothing too demanding. Nothing that made me feel my age. I could handle it all from my worn-out leather chair, looking out at the city street where people rushed by, lost in their own worlds, unaware of the lives being quietly altered just a few floors above. Then he came in. The door swung open with a faint creak, and I barely looked up from my paperwork. He didn't announce himself, but I felt his presence immediately, like a dark cloud moving into a room too bright to conceal it. Daniel was in his 40s, but the exhaustion on his face made him seem older. His suit, too large and cheap, hung on him like he was trying to disguise something that was already too obvious. A man out of place, out of time, trapped in something that wouldn't let him go. His eyes flickered with a nervous energy, darting around as if expecting someone to be watching him at any moment. He didn't sit. He just began speaking, his voice shaking slightly, but his words came fast, disjointed, chaotic. "They're stealing my work," he said, and I could already tell this wasn't going to be a run-of-the-mill case. But what he said next stopped me cold. "They put a listening device inside me," he continued, "during my vasectomy. It's the only explanation. They've been copying everything I create, selling it off to corporations. The government's been spying on me for years." I blinked, trying to catch up. The words didn't connect, didn't fit. My mind screamed in disbelief. "A listening device in your... what?" I asked, hoping he might clarify, that this was just some weird misunderstanding. He didn't hesitate. He pulled out an X-ray from his jacket pocket, the corners bent from too many times being unfolded. His fingers trembled as he held it up to me. "Look, see that? That's it. That's where they put it," he said, his voice rising with urgency. "Right in my groin. I know they're listening to me." I stared at the image. The X-ray was clear, too clear. A tiny metallic dot nestled in the area he pointed to, almost surgical in its placement. It looked like any other foreign object, but there was something off about it. I couldn't decide if it was real or if Daniel was spiraling into a deep paranoia. My gut told me to dismiss it, to chalk it up to a deranged mind. But the way he was looking at me, eyes wide, desperate, made something inside me pause. The skepticism I'd built up over the years was faltering. I felt something cold creeping in. Trying to regain control of the situation, I offered him the only logical advice I could muster. "Daniel, maybe you should see another doctor. A urologist, perhaps. Get a second opinion." At that, his eyes went dark. His hands clenched into fists on the desk, his knuckles white with the effort. The anger rose in him like a flood, and the room shifted, became heavier. He stood up, knocking his chair back, his face flushed with rage. "You're part of it, aren't you? You're covering it up too. All of you. They're watching me, and you're all in on it." His voice cracked as he slammed his hand onto the desk, the force shaking the papers and sending a jolt through my spine. My heart raced. This wasn't just an ordinary case anymore. This was something else. He was no longer just disturbed. He was dangerous. The air in the room turned thick, suffocating. I could almost feel the pressure, like a weight on my chest. I tried to stay calm, but Daniel wasn't listening. He was beyond reason now. He took a step toward the door, his back to me. But then, without warning, he spun around, his eyes wild, his words barely a whisper, but laced with venom. "You won't get away with this. You can't." The whisper hung in the air, charged with the kind of malice that prickled my skin. And before I could react, he lunged, sudden, swift, a burst of rage. His hands grabbed for me, and in an instant, I was no longer in control of the situation. I sidestepped instinctively, but my body moved sluggishly, as if frozen in place. His force collided with me, pushing me backward. My body hit the floor, the impact dizzying. I tried to regain my footing, but the world spun around me. That's when I felt it. An electrical jolt, sharp and blinding, shooting through my arm. The pain was blinding, but it passed in a flash, leaving a hollow ache behind. But Daniel? Daniel crumpled to the floor, as if something invisible had struck him down. His body convulsed for a second before he lay still, eyes open but vacant. He looked empty, as if the man I had been speaking to had been erased in a single sudden moment. I sat there staring at him, my breath coming in shallow gasps, my mind reeling. What the hell just happened? Was it a heart attack, a stroke, or was it something else, something beyond anything I could explain? I had no answers, only a deep, gnawing fear settling into my bones. As I sat in the aftermath, the room felt wrong, off, like I'd stepped into a nightmare and there was no waking up. I was alone in that office with a man who had come to me with a story of secrets, of paranoia, and now he was gone, just like that. And I couldn't shake the thought. Was it all just a story, or was something much darker at play here? I was still dazed from the fall, my body aching and my arm completely numb. As I blinked through the fog in my mind, I looked down at Daniel's unconscious body on the floor. His breathing was steady, thank God. But there was no comfort in that. Something felt deeply wrong, as if the air around me had thickened with uncertainty. The sound of the electric shock still rang in my ears, an eerie hum that seemed to vibrate through my bones. It took a moment before I realized something even more unsettling. I hadn't heard the door open. When I looked up, Paul and Marcos were standing there, as if they'd materialized from thin air. They held one of my tasers in their hands, the long metallic weapon still crackling with residual energy. Paul moved toward Daniel, checking his pulse with an unnervingly calm expression. Marcos spoke first, his voice firm, but there was a strange detachment in it. "He lost control," he said, as though we were discussing a minor inconvenience, not the violent episode that had just unfolded. "It's okay. He won't attack again." But even as Paul nodded, glancing over at me with a mix of concern and disbelief, I couldn't shake the feeling that nothing was okay. Not anymore. They looked at me with too much interest, too much understanding. It was as though they were watching me, evaluating me in a way that sent a cold shiver down my spine. The authorities arrived soon after, and I recounted what had happened in a daze, trying to hold it together. But something in my chest was tightening with every word I spoke. I didn't expect the reaction of the medical team, how they circled around Daniel, almost like they were preparing for something worse. They moved efficiently, but there was a chill in their eyes as they worked, a look of suspicion that I couldn't quite place. When the doctor, who accompanied Daniel to the hospital, met my gaze, I saw the flicker of something unspoken in his expression. "You did well in calling them," he said, his voice flat, but there was a subtle weight to his words. "But be careful. Sometimes what we see isn't what it seems." That statement haunted me. I tried to dismiss it as just cryptic doctor speak, but as the hours passed, it dug into me, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. What did he mean? And why did it feel like the doctor was trying to warn me about something beyond Daniel's unstable mind? Over the next few days, I tried to return to my routine, but the unease stayed with me, an insidious presence I couldn't shake. I told myself Daniel was just another paranoid client, someone who'd convinced himself of a delusion. But the nagging doubt wouldn't leave. I remembered the X-ray, the strange metallic object nestled in his groin. It wasn't some fragment of his imagination. I knew that much. But then, what was it? And why did I feel like I was being dragged into something I didn't understand? Driven by the unease festering inside me, I began to dig deeper. I scoured the internet for any trace of these so-called listening devices, these rumors of surveillance implants hidden in the human body. Most of what I found was nothing more than vague urban legends, anecdotes, hearsay, and dark web forums where paranoia ran rampant. But then I stumbled upon something that made my skin crawl. An article buried in a corner of the web, written in cryptic, unverified language about a mind control program, supposedly being tested on civilians. There was talk of covert operations, implantations of devices, and clandestine surveillance programs. But the sources were as unreliable as they were frightening. The more I read, the more I felt myself spiraling. It felt like a conspiracy, one so vast, so intricately hidden, that it couldn't possibly be true. But the keywords haunted me. Implantation of devices, government surveillance, clandestine projects. The more I read, the more a nagging thought took root in my mind. What if Daniel wasn't just imagining things? What if somehow he was right? I tried to ignore it. I tried to believe it was all madness. But there was a voice inside me, growing louder every day, that whispered, "What if you're missing something?" Days passed, and I visited the hospital where Daniel was being held. He'd been sedated heavily, his eyes glazed over, and the once vibrant energy that had defined him was gone. When I spoke to the doctor overseeing him, the words he said did little to put me at ease. He truly believed something was implanted in his body, the doctor told me, his expression unreadable. But all we've found are signs of extreme stress and paranoia. No foreign objects, no implants. Yet, even as he said it, there was something in his eyes, something that felt like a lie, a small flicker of uncertainty. What was he hiding? Time passed, and the case faded. Daniel became just another strange, unsolved mystery. I never heard from him again. Not a word, not a trace. It was as though he had vanished completely. I even tried searching, but everything I found led to nothing. No phone records, no history. It was as if he had been erased from the world entirely, and that was the worst part. I never knew if I'd uncovered the truth, or if I'd simply gotten too close to something I wasn't meant to understand. What Daniel said, what he showed me, it never left me. Every day I wondered, what if it wasn't all just in his head? What if I'm the one who's blind? And somewhere, deep down, I couldn't help but fear that, if it were real, the truth might be something far worse than anything I could have imagined.